In a room filled with masterpieces and prodigies, he was the only one holding a worn-out sketchbook. They mocked him, humiliated him, and laughed behind his back. But they had no idea that within those frayed pages lay a story powerful enough to silence the entire room and bring the judges to tears. As the competition began, Lucas took his place at the far end of the exhibition hall, away from the spotlight, away from the whispers. He laid his sketchbook on the display stand, smoothing the pages carefully, treating each drawing as if it were made of glass. The other contestants proudly presented their paintings on massive canvases, bursting with color and technique. Bold brushstrokes, elaborate designs, and expensive frames, all screaming wealth and privilege. Yet, Lucas's exhibit was just an open sketchbook, pages filled with pencil sketches, raw and unfiltered. He looked down at his drawings. They were simple, but they were his truth. Each page held a piece of his heart, fragments of memories he could never relive, emotions too powerful to speak aloud. There was the sketch of his mother, her eyes warm and gentle, holding him as a child, comforting him through nights of tears. Another showed his small apartment in Brooklyn, cramped but full of love. And on the final page, a sketch of a broken heart taped together, symbolizing the pain he endured when she passed away. His mother, who had always believed in his talent, who had saved every crumpled piece of paper he had ever drawn on, who had whispered to him in her final days, "Never let them tell you that you're not good enough." Lucas's eyes stung, but he blinked back the tears. He couldn't cry. Not here, not now. He stood back, taking one last look at his display. No color, no glitter, no gold, just raw emotion, his truth. As the judges began their rounds, Lucas watched them move from one extravagant painting to another, nodding in approval, murmuring words of praise. Then they approached Ethan's display. Ethan stood tall, his chest puffed with pride. His painting was a vibrant, abstract masterpiece, bursting with color and complexity. It was impressive, dazzling, perfect. The judges were mesmerized, complimenting him on his technique, his creativity. Ethan's smile grew wider with each word of praise. Then they moved toward Lucas. He felt his heart leap into his throat. He didn't expect applause. He didn't expect praise. He just wanted them to see him, to see his story. The judges stopped in front of his sketchbook, their faces blank. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and perfectly styled hair, leaned in, her expression confused. "Is this the entry?" Lucas's face turned red, shame creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, Ethan's voice cut through the air. "Yeah, that's his art," Ethan said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "He probably found that sketchbook in the trash. I think I even saw some crayon marks." Laughter erupted behind him. Lucas's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood his ground, even as his chest tightened, even as his heart broke. The judges exchanged puzzled glances. One of them, an older man with gray hair and glasses, Leonard Whitaker, the head judge, flipped through the sketchbook, his fingers moving delicately over each page. For a moment, his face softened. His eyes lingered on the sketch of Lucas's mother, her gentle smile, her arms wrapped around a tiny child. He traced the lines, his fingers trembling slightly. Then his expression hardened and he closed the sketchbook, placing it back on the stand. He cleared his throat, his voice cold and dismissive. "There's no color, no complexity. It's primitive. This isn't art, it's just scribbles." Lucas felt his heart shatter. The words cut deeper than any insult Ethan could have thrown at him. He had poured his soul into those pages, his pain, his love, his memories, and they were dismissed as scribbles. Ethan burst out laughing, his entourage joining in, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. Lucas's face burned with humiliation. He wanted to scream, to cry, to tear down his sketchbook and run. But he didn't. He stood there, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands shaking. Leonard turned to the other judges. "Let's move on. There's nothing worth judging here." They walked away, their footsteps fading, their laughter lingering. Ethan shot Lucas a smug grin, his eyes dancing with victory. "I told you they'd laugh you out of here." Lucas didn't respond. He couldn't. His voice was gone, swallowed by the pain lodged in his chest. But as he looked down at his sketchbook, his mother's smile staring back at him, he felt a warmth spread through him. Her voice echoed in his memory, "Never let them tell you that you're not good enough." His grip tightened on his sketchbook. They didn't understand. They didn't see. But he wouldn't let them win. Not this time. He lifted his head, his eyes blazing with determination. This wasn't over. Not yet. Before we continue, comment below if you've ever felt underestimated. And if you love stories about courage and unexpected triumphs, don't forget to subscribe for more. Lucas stood frozen, his heart aching as the judges walked away, their laughter still echoing in his mind. He looked down at his sketchbook, his vision blurring as tears threatened to fall. Scribbles. That's what they called his memories, his pain, his love. Just scribbles. His shoulders sagged, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. He felt small, insignificant, just like they wanted him to feel. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not when his story was still untold. From across the room, Miss Clara Thompson watched him closely. She had been following the competition, curious about the boy who dared to enter with nothing but a tattered sketchbook. There was something about his drawings that caught her eye. Raw, emotional, real. She approached quietly, her voice gentle. "Lucas?" He jumped, quickly wiping his eyes before turning to face her. "Oh, hi. I didn't think anyone was watching." She smiled kindly, her eyes softening. "I've been watching you from the moment you walked in, and I saw what just happened." Lucas's face turned red. They said my drawings are just scribbles, that they're not art." His voice broke, his shoulders hunching as he looked down. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here." Ms. Thompson shook her head. "They're wrong." She reached out, gently opening his sketchbook to the page of his mother, her eyes filled with love as she cradled him in her arms. This is more than art. It's a memory. It's love. It's truth." Lucas's eyes widened, his heart thudding in his chest. You see that?" She nodded, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. "Art isn't about expensive supplies or flashy techniques. It's about truth. And your truth is here, in these pages." He swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. No one had ever looked at his drawings like this before, as if they were precious, as if they mattered. Ms. Thompson looked up, her gaze firm. "Don't let them silence your story. Don't let them tell you who you are." She stepped back, her eyes sparkling. "You have a gift, Lucas. Use it. Show them what they refuse to see." Her words sank deep into his heart, igniting a fire that had nearly gone out. Lucas looked down at his sketchbook, his fingers brushing over his mother's face. She believed in him. Ms. Thompson believed in him. He had to believe in himself. His eyes hardened with resolve. He wasn't done yet. Just then, a loud voice echoed through the hall. "Final round of judging begins now. All contestants, please stand by your exhibits." Lucas looked up, his heart racing. This was it, his last chance. He took his place by his sketchbook, standing tall, his shoulders squared. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. Ethan sauntered over, his smile dripping with arrogance. "Still here, loser? Didn't you get the message? Nobody cares about your sad little drawings." Lucas didn't flinch. He met Ethan's gaze, his voice steady. "They're not just drawings. They're my story." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, nobody wants to hear it." He turned away, his laughter echoing. Lucas stood firm, his hands trembling but his heart steady. Let them laugh. Let them mock him. He wasn't leaving until they saw his truth. The judges began their final round, moving slowly from one exhibit to the next. As they neared Lucas's sketchbook, his chest tightened, his breath catching. This was his moment. Leonard Whitaker approached first, his expression indifferent, almost bored. He glanced at the sketchbook, his eyes flicking over the pages without interest. Still the same, primitive, unrefined. One of the other judges, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, lingered longer. She leaned in, studying the details more closely. Her eyes softened, her lips parting as she looked at the sketch of Lucas's mother. "Wait, there's something here," she whispered, her voice thoughtful. She turned to Leonard. "Look at her eyes. Look at the way she's holding him. It's so tender. There's emotion here. Real emotion." Leonard frowned, clearly unimpressed. "It's sentimentality, cheap sentimentality. Art is about complexity, depth, mastery of technique, not whatever this is." The silver-haired judge's eyes narrowed. "You're wrong, Leonard. Art is about truth, and this is the most honest piece I've seen all day." Leonard's jaw tightened, his pride wounded. "Fine. If you want to waste your vote, go ahead. But I stand by my opinion. It's not art." He turned away, his movements stiff with irritation. The kind judge lingered a moment longer, her eyes meeting Lucas's. She smiled, a warm, understanding smile that made his chest tighten. She saw him. She saw his story. She nodded, her voice soft. "You're brave. Don't stop being brave." Lucas's eyes burned, but he held back his tears. He stood tall, his heart pounding, his spirit unbroken. No matter what happened next, no matter what the final decision would be, he had done it. He had shown them his truth, and nothing could take that away. The hall grew silent as the head judge, Leonard Whitaker, stood on the grand stage, a golden envelope in his hands. His face was stern, his lips pressed into a thin line as his gaze swept over the room, pausing briefly on Lucas. Lucas's heart pounded, his hands cold and clammy as he clutched his sketchbook tightly against his chest. His legs felt weak, and every breath seemed to catch in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and hoping for all at once. Ethan stood confidently near the front, his head held high, his smile smug. He had no doubt in his mind who the winner would be. He looked over his shoulder at Lucas, his eyes flashing with mockery. Leonard cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the hall. "The winner of this year's Galleria di Belle Arti Youth Art Competition, the artist whose work showed exceptional creativity, technical mastery, and emotional depth." Lucas's chest tightened, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on Leonard, waiting, hoping. "Ethan Montgomery." The room erupted into applause. Ethan's face split into a triumphant grin as he strutted up to the stage, his entourage cheering him on. Leonard shook his hand, his smile broad and approving. Ethan turned to face the audience, his eyes finding Lucas in the crowd. He lifted the golden trophy high above his head, his smirk widening. "I told you, loser, talent always wins." Lucas felt his heart shatter. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it refused to go away. It hurt. It hurt so much. He looked down at his sketchbook, his mother's face staring back at him, her gentle smile frozen in pencil lines. He had failed. He had shown them his truth, his heart, his pain, and it hadn't been enough. His shoulders slumped, his grip on the sketchbook loosening. It slipped from his fingers, falling to the floor with a dull thud. He didn't even have the strength to pick it up. "Excuse me." A voice cut through the applause, firm and unwavering. It was the silver-haired judge. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I must protest this decision." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Leonard's face darkened. "What is the meaning of this, Eleanor?" She stood tall, her chin lifted. "I refuse to stand by and watch true art be dismissed because of prejudice and arrogance." She turned, pointing directly at Lucas's sketchbook, lying open on the floor. This is the most honest piece of art in this room, and it deserves recognition." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Leonard's jaw tightened. "We judge based on technique, complexity, and emotion," she cut him off, her voice sharp. "Art is about connecting with the viewer, about making them feel something real. And his work—" She picked up the sketchbook, holding it up for all to see. "Is raw, powerful, and painfully beautiful." She turned to the audience, her voice trembling with emotion. "This boy has captured love, loss, and hope on these pages. He has shown his heart, his soul, and it is magnificent." A hush fell over the hall as she turned back to Leonard. "You dismissed his work because it wasn't wrapped in luxury, because it was simple. But art doesn't need gold frames and expensive paints to be great. Sometimes the most beautiful stories are told with the simplest tools." Leonard's face flushed with anger. "This is highly irregular." "No," she interrupted, her eyes blazing. "What's irregular is letting prejudice blind us to real talent." She turned to the other judges, her gaze piercing. "If you truly looked at his work, not through the lens of wealth or status, but through the lens of humanity, you would see the brilliance in every line, every stroke. You would see him." Lucas's heart pounded, his breath caught in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She understood. She saw him. Ethan's face turned red, his fists clenched. "This is ridiculous. I won fair and square." Eleanor's eyes snapped to him, her voice cold. "You won because you followed the rules of privilege. But you didn't make anyone feel. You didn't tell a story. You showed off your wealth, not your heart." The room was dead silent, tension crackling in the air. Leonard looked around, his authority slipping. This is unprecedented." Eleanor turned to the crowd. "I ask for a revote. Let the audience decide. Let the people this art was meant to reach decide which piece touched their hearts the most." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, voices rising in support. "Yes, let us vote. We want to see his work. Show us the sketches." Leonard's shoulders slumped, his resistance crumbling under the pressure. "Very well, a revote." Eleanor smiled, turning to Lucas, her eyes warm. "Show them your story, Lucas." Lucas's hands trembled as he walked to the front of the hall, his heart racing. He stood beside Eleanor, his sketchbook open in his hands. His voice shook as he spoke. These are my memories, my mother, She taught me to draw, to feel, to never give up. She passed away last year, and these drawings, they're all I have left of her." Gasps echoed through the room. People leaned forward, their eyes wide, their faces softening. Lucas flipped through the pages, his voice breaking. "This is her holding me when I was little. She used to sing to me every night, until she couldn't anymore." Tears glistened in the audience's eyes. Lucas looked up, his voice steady. "I didn't have money for paints or canvases, but I had my memories. I had my love, and that's what I put into these pages." The hall was silent, many wiping tears from their eyes. Eleanor turned to Leonard, her voice firm. "Now, let them vote." Leonard looked at the faces in the crowd, their eyes shining with emotion. He knew the result before the votes were even counted. He sighed, his voice resigned. "The winner is Lucas Rivera." The hall erupted into applause, louder than anything Lucas had ever heard. People stood cheering, tears streaming down their faces. Lucas's knees buckled, his heart soaring. He had done it. He had shown them his truth. Eleanor handed him the golden trophy, her smile warm and proud. "Your story is your power. Never let anyone silence it." Lucas looked out at the cheering crowd, his heart full. His mother's face appeared in his mind, her smile bright and loving. He whispered softly, "I did it, Mom. I did it." The applause echoed through the grand hall, shaking Lucas to his very core. He stood there, his eyes wide, his heart pounding as the weight of his victory sank in. People were cheering for him, for his story, for his truth. Ethan's face was a mask of disbelief, his jaw clenched, his fist trembling. He stood frozen, unable to process how his perfectly crafted masterpiece had been overshadowed by a sketchbook, a tattered, old sketchbook. His entourage backed away, avoiding his furious glare. Leonard Whitaker remained on the stage, his shoulders tense, his face pale. He looked down at Lucas, his expression a mix of shock and grudging respect. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he couldn't deny it. He had been wrong. Lucas stood in the center of the room, the golden trophy heavy in his hands. His vision blurred as he looked down at his sketchbook, still open to the drawing of his mother's gentle smile. He felt a lump rise in his throat, his chest tightening. This was for her. This was all for her. Eleanor approached him, her smile warm, her eyes glistening with tears. "You did it, Lucas. You made them see." Lucas swallowed hard, his voice breaking. I never thought." His shoulders shook as he looked around, the faces of strangers filled with admiration and emotion. "I never thought they'd understand." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The truth has a way of touching hearts, and your truth is more powerful than any brushstroke." His lips trembled as he looked down, the memories flooding back, long nights drawing by the dim light of his mother's bedside lamp. Her voice, soft and weak, encouraging him even as the sickness took her away, her hands delicate and frail, holding his drawings as if they were the most precious treasures in the world. He wiped his eyes quickly, his breath shuddering. I did this for her." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she would be so proud. The room grew quiet as Leonard stepped forward, his expression tight. He looked at Lucas, his jaw clenched, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Lucas, I owe you an apology." Lucas looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Leonard's shoulders slumped, his gaze falling to the floor. "I judged you before I ever looked at your work. I saw your clothes, your sketchbook, and I dismissed you. I was wrong." His voice wavered, his pride visibly crumbling. "Your art, it moved people. It moved me." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Even Eleanor's eyebrows rose in astonishment. Leonard looked up, his eyes meeting Lucas's. "I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've seen countless paintings, sculptures, exhibitions, but nothing has ever made me feel the way your drawings did." His lips pressed together, his voice breaking. "You reminded me of what art is supposed to be. Honest, raw, real." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He never expected this, not from Leonard Whitaker, not from the man who had called his work scribbles. Leonard took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. "I'm retiring at the end of this season, but before I go, I want to make sure this industry remembers what matters, and that starts with you." He reached out, his hand trembling. "Congratulations, Lucas. You've given me hope for the future of art." Lucas stared at the outstretched hand, his chest tightening with emotion. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers closing around Leonard's. The handshake was firm, sincere, a gesture of respect, a gesture of redemption. The audience erupted into applause once more, the sound reverberating off the marble walls. Lucas felt his chest swell with pride, his heart full. This wasn't just his victory, it was his mother's. It was for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Ethan watched from the side, his face pale, his fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout, to protest, but no words came. His eyes fell to the floor, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his defeat. For the first time, he was invisible. Eleanor took the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "This competition is about more than technique or style. It's about heart. It's about truth. And Lucas Rivera has shown us that the simplest tools can create the most powerful art." The crowd cheered, their faces glowing with admiration. Lucas felt tears prick at his eyes, his vision blurring as he looked down at his mother's smile one last time. He whispered softly, "I hope you're watching, Mom. I hope you're proud." Eleanor wrapped an arm around his shoulders, guiding him off the stage. "This is just the beginning, Lucas. The world needs to hear your story. Never stop telling it." He nodded, his heart pounding with hope, with courage, with love. He had found his voice, and no one would ever silence it again. Lucas stepped out of the grand hall, the golden trophy still clutched tightly in his hands. The evening air was cool against his skin, the city lights of New York flickering like stars above him. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he let the moment sink in. He had done it. He had shown them his truth, and they had seen him, really seen him. He looked down at his sketchbook, the pages worn and yellowed, each drawing holding a piece of his heart. He gently ran his fingers over the sketch of his mother, her warm eyes gazing back at him, her smile tender and loving. "I did it, Mom. I made them see." His voice wavered, tears stinging his eyes. He closed his eyes, feeling her presence, her love surrounding him like a warm embrace. It was as if she was standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice whispering in his ear, "I'm proud of you, my son." The door behind him creaked open, and he turned to see Eleanor walking out, her face illuminated by the golden glow of the street lamps. She approached him, her smile kind and knowing. "You showed them, Lucas. You showed them what real art is." Lucas's cheeks flushed. I never thought they'd understand." Eleanor laughed softly. "You didn't just make them understand. You made them feel. That's more powerful than any brushstroke or technique." She looked at his sketchbook, her eyes softening. "Your mother, she must have been an incredible woman." Lucas's throat tightened. She was. She taught me everything, not just about drawing, but about life, about love. His voice grew quiet, his fingers brushing the page. I miss her every day. Eleanor's eyes glistened, her voice gentle. She's still with you, Lucas. In every line, every shade, in every story you tell. He looked up, his eyes wide. Do you really think so? She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. I know so. And the world needs to see more of her, more of you. Lucas's heart thudded, his chest tightening with hope. But I don't have the money for art school. I don't even have proper supplies. Eleanor's smile widened. Leave that to me. She pulled a business card from her pocket, handing it to him. I run an art mentorship program. We sponsor young talents, give them the resources and guidance they need. And I would be honored if you'd be my student. Lucas's mouth fell open, his eyes wide with shock. You want to teach me? She laughed, her eyes sparkling. No, Lucas. I want to learn from you. His chest tightened, his vision blurring with tears. I don't know what to say. Say yes, she whispered, her voice warm. Say yes, and let your story reach the world. Lucas looked down at his sketchbook, at his mother's face, her smile gentle and encouraging. He heard her voice, soft and loving. Never let them tell you that you're not good enough. He looked back at Eleanor, his chin lifting, his voice steady. Yes, I'll do it. I'll share my story. Eleanor's face broke into a radiant smile. Good, because the world needs to see the beauty you create. As they stood there under the city lights, Lucas felt his heart soar. The pain, the doubt, the fear, they were still there, lingering like shadows. But they no longer controlled him. He had found his voice, his courage, his truth. He looked up at the sky, his eyes shining. I won't let you down, Mom. I promise. Eleanor stepped back, her eyes twinkling. Come on, let me show you the world that's waiting for you. Lucas followed her down the street, his sketchbook clutched against his chest, his steps light. He had walked into the competition feeling small, broken, invisible. But he was walking away with a new beginning, a new purpose. As they turned the corner, the city lights dancing around them, Lucas looked up at the stars, his heart full. He was no longer just a boy with a worn-out sketchbook. He was an artist, and his story was just beginning. Before you go, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think about Lucas's journey and his incredible courage? If you love stories that reveal unexpected talent and powerful transformations, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching and supporting Stories That Matter.